I kept rehearsing the sentence in my head the way a man worries a loose tooth, tongue pressing, testing, pulling back, pressing again, because if I said it out loud, there would be no taking it back. The words were simple, almost polite, the kind of warning you could slip into a room without raising your voice. But every time I tried to imagine the sound of my own voice cutting through that air, my stomach tightened like a fist. It wasn't courage that stopped me. It wasn't loyalty, either. It was something smaller and more humiliating, an instinct to survive the moment in front of me, even if it meant sacrificing the moment that came after. I could feel my body choosing before my mind had finished arguing. Shoulders steady, face neutral, breath measured, as if calm could make my thoughts less visible. I had seen mistakes before. Everyone. War manufactures mistakes the way it manufactures smoke. You learn to live inside them. You learn to step over them. You learn to tell yourself that the machine is too large for one pair of hands to slow it down. But this was different. This wasn't an accident of weather or confusion or exhaustion. This was a decision forming, clean, deliberate, spoken with certainty, and I could see the clarity that felt almost offensive where it would. The warning came to me in pieces at first, a detail that didn't match, a small assumption left unchallenged, a familiar confidence resting on something flimsy, the kind of thing no one notices until the moment it becomes the only thing there is to notice. It arrived like a cold draft under a door. I remember thinking, if I say nothing, it will happen, and then, even worse, if I say something, it might happen anyway, and then I will have to live with being the man who spoke and still failed. I listened to other voices as if they were rocks being stacked, one on top of another, heavier with every. There were pauses where someone could have questioned. There were spaces between sentences that felt like open windows. But the room didn't invite air. It swallowed it. In that kind of quiet, your own thoughts sound loud enough to betray you. I told myself I was being cautious. I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself that people above me carried maps, numbers, authority, things I didn't have. I told myself my doubt was just fear dressed up as insight, and each excuse felt reasonable for exactly as long as it took to say it silently. The worst part wasn't that I didn't speak right away. The worst part was how quickly my silence began to feel normal, how easily the tongue learns to stay still. My mouth went dry, not from thirst but from restraint. I swallowed one, hard, as if I could force the warning back down where it belonged. And when the moment finally came, when the sentence rose up in me, complete and urgent, ready to cross the gap between thought and sound, I felt it stop at the base of my throat, as if my body had decided that keeping it inside was safer than letting it live. So I held my face the way I had practiced holding it. I nodded when others nodded. I breathed when others breathed, and the warning died in my throat. The days followed a pattern that made silence feel like part of the uniform. Orders arrived already shaped, already confident, and by the time they reached those of us who stood nearby, their edges had been smoothed by repetition. They were spoken the same way every time, with the same calm assurance, as if certainty itself were contagious. You learned quickly that hesitation had a sound, doubt had a posture, and both were noticed. I was close enough to hear conversations that were never meant to be recorded, close enough to stand just outside the circle where decisions were finalized, where voices lowered and language became precise. My role placed me in rooms where I wasn't expected to contribute, only to absorb, to listen, to remember, to carry information from one place to another without leaving fingerprints on it. It was a position that rewarded reliability and punished friction. Hierarchy wasn't enforced loudly. It didn't need to be. It existed in the way people stood when certain men entered the room, in the way sentences shortened when authority was present. You could feel it in the air, like pressure before a storm. Speaking out of turn wasn't forbidden. It was simply understood to be unnecessary, unwelcome, a complication. Everyone had a task. Everyone had a lane. The structure was presented as protection. Protection from chaos, from confusion, from the kind of disorder that gets people killed. And in many ways, it worked. The system moved because it didn't pause to ask every voice for permission. It moved because someone always knew whose voice mattered. I learned early what happened to those who disrupted that rhythm. Not dramatically, not publicly. They weren't dragged away or shouted down. They were reassigned, overlooked. Their names stopped appearing on lists. Their presence became optional. It was a quiet erasure, efficient and bloodless. Watching it happen was enough to teach the lesson. There were moments, though, when the machinery slowed just enough to reveal its seams, a briefing that relied too heavily on assumption, a plan that leaned on confidence rather than confirmation. These were not reckless people. They were experienced, decorated, respected. That made questioning them feel less like responsibility and more like accusation. I knew my position in that structure. I wasn't there to challenge. I was there to support, to facilitate, to ensure that what was decided could be carried out without delay. The unspoken rule was simple. If you saw something wrong, You assumed someone else had already considered it, someone with better information, someone with authority. Fear didn't announce itself as fear. It arrived disguised as professionalism, as respect, as discipline. The idea of interrupting the flow felt almost obscene, like shouting in a church. Even imagining it made my pulse quicken. Not because I believed I would be punished severely, but because I knew I would be remembered. War has a way of shrinking the acceptable range of behavior. There's little patience for uncertainty when time is measured in minutes and lives. Doubt becomes a liability. Silence becomes proof that you belong. So I stood where I was supposed to stand. I listened when I was supposed to listen. I told myself that proximity to power was not the same as permission to. And with every passing day, the distance between what I noticed and what I said grew wider, until it felt like a gap no single sentence could cross. The thought didn't arrive all at once. It crept in, wearing different disguises, waiting to see if I would recognize what it was. At first, it was just an irritation, a detail that wouldn't settle, a line that didn't quite connect. I told myself that unease was a normal companion and that everyone carried it in some form. But this one didn't fade. It stayed with, followed me through routine, pressed itself into the quiet moments, when there was nothing else demanding my attention. I began to argue with myself in fragments. I would rehearse objections silently, stripping them down, rebuilding them, trying to make them sound less like doubt and more like assistance. I wasn't challenging the decision. I was refining it. I imagined speaking calmly, almost apologetically, as if tone alone could soften the occasion. But even in my imagination, I could see the shift it would cause, the pause, the glance, the subtle recalibration of how I was seen. There were moments when the words climbed close enough to my mouth that I could feel them, a question hovering just behind my teeth, a clarification waiting for breath. Each time, something stopped it. Sometimes it was the presence of others. Sometimes it was the way the room seemed already committed to the path ahead. And sometimes it was simply the weight of knowing that once spoken, the warning would no longer belong to me. I thought about consequences the way a man studies a map he's afraid to follow. If I spoke, and I was wrong, the cost would be immediate. My judgment questioned, my reliability reduced, my future narrowed quietly. If I spoke, and I was right, the outcome was less clear. The plan might still proceed. The warning might be noted and ignored. And then I would carry not only the knowledge of failure, but the memory of having been heard and dismissed. It was easier to believe that silence was neutral, that by saying nothing, I wasn't choosing anything. I told myself that responsibility belonged to those who gave, not those who noticed cracks forming. But I told myself that doubt without authority was just noise. These thoughts felt solid and logical, necessary, but they never lasted. At night, when the day's urgency loosened its grip, the arguments unraveled. I would replay the scenes in my head, inserting myself into them, imagining how little effort it would have taken to speak. A sentence, a raised hand, a pause introduced into the flow. The simplicity of it haunted me. Fear took on different shapes as time went on. It wasn't just fear of punishment or exclusion. It was fear of being wrong in public, fear of being right too early, fear of standing alone in a room full of certainty. And beneath all of it was a quieter fear, that my silence was not caution but cowardice, and that I knew the difference. The more I delayed, the heavier the moment. The opportunity to speak felt less like an opening and more like a test. I was failing in slow motion. Each passing hour added weight to the choice, until the thought of breaking the silence felt almost violent, an act that would rupture something fragile and necessary. Still, I told myself there would be another moment, a better moment, one where the warning would sound less like an interruption and more like wisdom. I clung to that belief, even as the space for it narrowed, and the words, unspoken, pressed harder against my chest. The moment arrived without ceremony, no dramatic shift in tone, no sense that anything final was about to be decided. It came disguised as routine, as another step in a sequence that had already been rehearsed too many times to feel uncertain. Voices moved through familiar phrases, papers were adjusted. A decision took shape the way they always did, calm, deliberate, untroubled by the absence of dissent. I felt it before I understood it, a tightening low in my body, like the instinct you get when you miss a step on the stair. The warning surged forward, complete now, no longer fragments or possibilities. It was clear, specific, urgent, and for the first time, I knew with absolute certainty that this was the last chance. My breathing changed. I became aware of my mouth, my tongue, the effort it would take to form the first sound. The room seemed to narrow, as if the distance between me and the others had grown wider without anyone moving. I could hear my own pulse, steady and unhelpful, marking time that was slipping away. Someone spoke, confirming the decision. Another voice followed, agreeing. The order settled into place, solidifying with every repetition. I watched it happen, as if from a slight remove, already sensing the permanence of what was forming. All that remained was my voice, or its absence. I imagined interrupting, not dramatically, just enough to introduce friction. I imagined the heads turning, the brief silence that would follow, the attention focused on me. I imagined the words leaving my mouth and existing in the room, unable to be pulled back or softened. They would stand on their own, stripped of my intentions, open to interpretation. My throat tightened, not metaphorically, physically. The muscles drew in, as if bracing against impact. I swallowed once, then again, trying to clear a path that refused to open. The sensation was almost painful, a pressure that made my eyes sting. I could feel heat rising in my face, the body's quiet alarm. The choice wasn't made with a thought, it was made with a pause, a fraction of a second where I could have acted and didn't. In that space, fear did not shout, it whispered. It reminded me of my place, of the weight of the room, of how easily one voice could be dismissed. It suggested that silence was safer, that the moment would pass whether I spoke or not, and so it did. The decision moved forward, the conversation shifted, the room exhaled and began preparing for what came next. No one looked at me, because there was no reason to. I had given no signal that I carried anything worth hearing. As the meeting ended, I realized something with a clarity that felt almost cruel. The warning hadn't been taken from me. It hadn't been suppressed or ignored. It had been offered, fully formed, and I had chosen to keep it inside. The silence settled in my body then, heavy and unmistakable, as permanent as the order that had just been given. The first signs arrived quietly, the way bad news often does when it no longer has to announce itself. There was no single moment that confirmed my fear, no dramatic rupture that could be pointed to and named. Instead, there were absences, delays that stretched longer than expected, reports that came back thinner than they should have been, missing details that one commented. I watched people adjust without acknowledging why. Explanations were offered, accepted, and filed away. Weather, timing, miscommunication. Each one sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a pattern I recognized too well. I listened to these explanations with a practiced stillness, my face arranged into the same neutral mask I had learned to wear. Inside, the warning replayed itself, no longer hypothetical, no longer imagined. Time began to feel uneven. Some hours dragged, heavy with anticipation. Others vanished, swallowed by routine. In that distortion, the consequences unfolded not as a single blow, but as a series of confirmations, each one small enough to be survivable, each one adding weight. I found myself paying attention to details I had once ignored, the way certain names stopped being mentioned, the way conversations ended abruptly when specific topics surfaced, the way silence gathered around certain questions, thicker than before. No one said what was happening, but everyone adjusted their behavior as if they knew. I told myself there was still uncertainty, that what I feared might not fully come to pass. Hope lingered in narrow spaces, sustained by the human instinct to believe in correction. But hope grew thinner with every passing day. The machine did not slow. It compensated. It absorbed loss and continued forward, its movement proof enough for those who relied on it. When confirmation finally arrived, it did not come with shock. It came with recognition, a quiet alignment between what I had imagined and what now existed. The sensation was not relief, nor was it horror. It was a dull settling, like something heavy finding its proper place. I did not react outwardly. No one. Grief, in that environment, was managed privately. A nod here, a pause there. The cost was acknowledged only in the way routines tightened, as if discipline itself could seal the cracks. I participated in that tightening. I followed instructions. I completed tasks. From the outside, nothing distinguished me from anyone else. Inside, the distance between silence and consequence collapsed. I could no longer pretend they were separate. Each outcome traced a line back to that moment of hesitation, to the pause where I had chosen not to speak. The connection was not logical or provable. It was felt, deeply, permanently. I avoided mirrors when I could, not out of guilt that demanded confession, but out of an unwillingness to meet the version of myself that now existed. The one who had known, the one who had stayed quiet. That knowledge did not accuse me. It simply remained. As the days continued, the consequences settled into history. They became facts, referenced without emotion, absorbed into reports and recollections. Others spoke of them as events. I experienced them as echoes, each one returning me to the same place, the same silence, the same unspoken sentence that now had nowhere to go. Time did not dull it. That was the first thing I learned. It changed the shape of the memory, blurred some edges, erased faces and voices, but it never reduced the weight. The silence stayed intact, preserved the way certain sounds are preserved when they are never allowed to exist. A word unspoken does not fade the way a spoken one does. It waits. Long after the uniforms were folded away, long after routines dissolved and the noise of those days receded, I found that the moment still lived in my body, not as an image, but as a sensation, a tightness that returned without warning, a pressure behind the sternum, a familiar constriction in the throat that appeared when I least expected it, as if my body had learned a lesson my mind could not forget. I tried to place the responsibility elsewhere, on the system, on the distance between observation and authority, on the idea that one voice could not have altered the course of what followed. These thoughts came easily, rehearsed over years, worn smooth by repetition. They explained everything without resolving anything. They accounted for the past without relieving it. Memory did not argue, it didn't accuse or demand. It simply replayed. Not the consequence, I could live with those being abstract, but the moment itself, the pause, the fraction of time where action was possible, the precise instant when silence won. That was what returned, again and again, stripped of context, stripped of justification, reduced to its most unbearable simplicity. I began to notice how often silence was praised, how often restraint was mistaken for wisdom, how easily quiet blended into the background and was mistaken for professionalism, for discipline, for maturity. I recognized myself in those descriptions and felt nothing like pride. I understood then that silence leaves no visible mark. It carries no signature. It does not ask to be defended, and because of that, it survives untouched. There were moments when I wondered what would have happened if I had spoken, not in the sense of outcome, but in the sense of identity. Who would I have been afterward? A man who tried, a man who disrupted, a man who failed loudly instead of succeeding quietly. The thought lingered not as regret, but as an absence, a version of myself that never came into being. Years passed. Life layered itself over the memory, as it always does. New responsibilities, new roles, new silences. And yet, whenever I found myself holding back a thought, measuring the cost of interruption, I felt the old weight return, not as instruction, as recognition. The warning I never gave did not disappear. It did not dissolve into history or get absorbed by explanation. It stayed exactly where it had formed, lodged at the point where intention becomes action. I learned to live with it there, to breathe around it, to speak around it, but I never learned to remove it. I am not haunted by what I said. I am haunted by what never entered the world at all. By the knowledge that silence can feel like safety in the moment and become something else entirely when time stretches long enough to reveal its shape. There is no sound attached to that realization, no dramatic understanding, just a quiet, enduring awareness that the most permanent thing I carried out was not a memory of violence or fear, but a sentence that never found air and never stopped asking to be spoken.